Hello, and welcome everybody to today's Virtual Ethical Innovation Lecture, or VAIL as we call it. With this lecture series, we intend to help disseminate insights and spread the words about initiatives like today's Ada Lovelace Institute and also researchers like today's guest, and spark debate about the ethical and societal aspects of technology in general. We're very happy if you can find the time to fit this lecture into your busy schedule. That's why we designed it to be on a Tuesday early afternoon. And I think, in fact, we've tried to bring this format to people that don't think about ethics of technology every day, but can still have a bite-sized introduction to some of the dominant and very interesting topics along the way. And this Virtual Ethical Innovation Lecture is supported by the Academy of Humanities and Sciences in Hamburg, which we're grateful for. Before we continue, allow me to say a quick word about us. We are the Ethical Innovation Hub, which is a research group that is a joint venture of both the Institute for Electrical Engineering and Medicine and the Institute for the History of Medicine and Science Studies. So we try to build bridges between humanities and technology here, doing research on how ethical considerations can be used as a driver for innovation and technology development processes, doing technology development in a responsible way. Before we continue with our today's speaker, let's have a brief look at the program for this term. So today we have Aidan Peppin. I'm going to introduce you in just a minute. Next time, it's still November this time, we will have Alice Hein and Lukas Meyer, previously from the Technical University of Munich. Now Lukas Meyer is from is in Cambridge. Sorry about that. They will talk about ethical decision making in the clinic. After that, we'll have Carsten Weber of the OTH Regensburg talking about cybersecurity and ethics, and then early next year we'll have Benjamin Strenge talking about an approach to connect ethical analysis to system design decision making. But today, I'm very happy that we have Aidan Peppin from the Ada Lovelace Institute. He's a senior researcher there, and he works on public engagement projects that address societal impacts of technology across a range of different sectors, I'd say. For instance, before joining the Ada Lovelace Institute, you were with the Wellcome Trust working on societal and ethical issues of health and data technology. And in fact, we switched topics. So I think this is now very current, and I'm very, very glad even that we switched topics. The other one would have been very interesting as well. But today we're talking about a core ingredient, I think, to doing responsible technology development, or AI in particular. So today, Aidan Peppin will talk about deepening participation, sorry, in data and AI policies. I would ask all the attendees to note down your questions in the Q&A window. I'll keep track of them. We'll first go through Mr. Peppin's talk in its entirety and do the Q&A session afterwards, which will be recorded for us to then summarize, but it will not be put up anywhere else. So we'll cut everything that we'll record short of the Q&A section. You can then, of course, also ask your questions using a microphone and even turn on the video, which you're not allowed right now to do, but I will allow this if you've joined using the app, that is. And now, without further ado, I'd like to ask Aidan Peppin to present his research. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much, Christian. Thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. I'm really glad to be able to talk with you all today and to share some of our work. So yeah, as Christian said, I'm Aidan. I'm a senior researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute. We're based in London. I guess by background, I'm a sociologist of technology, I suppose. But labels are always a bit fuzzy and never quite stick. Today, I wanted to talk to you. Oh, my slides aren't moving. There we go. I wanted to talk to you about three things, or try and address three questions. The first is why participation? Why does it matter? Why are we interested in it at the Ada Lovelace Institute? Second is, what is participation? What do we mean by participation when we're talking about policy and practice relating to data and AI? And thirdly, what can we learn from participation? But before I dive into those three questions, I thought I'd just give you a little bit more background about the institute that I'm based at. So Ada Lovelace Institute is an independent research institute and deliberative body with a mission to ensure data and AI work for people and society. And so we are not a university centre, nor are we a think tank, but we're sort of an organisation that I guess sits somewhere between academia, the world of policy, and industry. And we're a mix of social scientists like me, but also economists, technologists, policy professionals, philosophers. I think we've got the odd legal scholar as well. So quite an interdisciplinary bunch, but very much at the social sciences and humanities end of the spectrum, but with a good measure of more technologically minded folks in the mix as well. And we try to do three things. That's the first is to convene diverse voices. So that's bringing together people with different disciplinary backgrounds, but also people with different professional backgrounds, as well as diverse cross-section of the public. And we bring all those voices together to create an inclusive understanding of the ethical issues that arise from data and artificial intelligence. The second thing we do is build evidence. So that's through empirical research, literature reviews, synthesis of existing research, and working groups and many more. We build that evidence to support rigorous research and to foster an informed debate about how these technologies that are driven by data and AI affect people in society. And thirdly, we try to take all those diverse perspectives and all that evidence and then shape and inform good policy and practice. The idea being that policy and practice can then prioritize societal benefits from data and AI. So broadly, convene diverse voices, build evidence and shape practice. And currently we do this across five program areas or five thematic areas. And that's these ones on the screen: biometrics, health data, public sector use of data and algorithms, ethics and accountability in practice, and the future of regulation. Some of these programs we've been working on for a little while. We're only about 3.5 years old as an institute, but biometrics and health data we've been working on pretty much since the start. And throughout the COVID pandemic, both of these themes have become particularly important. And then we have done work on the other three, but only recently kind of solidified these as programs of work. And most prominently at the moment, the future of regulation. My colleagues working on that are deeply focused on the current consultation happening in the United Kingdom at the moment, which is reviewing the Data Protection Act and the GDPR as it stands in the United Kingdom. So a very interesting time in the UK. Obviously, since leaving the EU, I think one of the first things our government wanted to do was revisit the GDPR. We won't go into any more opinions or thoughts there, but that's a big topic that some of my colleagues are concerned with. But suffice to say, running through all of these programs is a strand of work which we call public engagement, which basically involves citizens, members of the public, data subjects, however you want to refer to them, but involves them in more participatory methods that can inform both our work and the wider landscape. So why do we, sorry, that's my doorbell, I can ignore that. Apologies for the noise. Why do we need participation is one of the questions I really want to ask or try and talk through a little bit today. Why does it matter to us so much at the Ada Lovelace Institute? Well, there's a piece of work, a report we published last year called No Green Lights, No Red Lines, which drew from some existing public engagement work we'd done in relation to the way technologies had been deployed during the pandemic. And in it, we say data-driven technologies are rarely disconnected from the societal and cultural contexts in which they are deployed, which is no bold statement, but we think it's often overlooked, this fact. So in other words, we recognize that data and AI technologies are shaped by values and choices, or value-based choices, that inform the design and deployment of technologies that are driven by data and AI. So value-based choices shape what the technology aims to achieve, how it's built, who it affects, how it affects them, how transparent it is, who profits or benefits from that system, and so on. And one of the things we recognize is that those value-based choices are rarely determined by those who are most impacted by the outcomes of those systems. So the people that get to decide what a technology does are not the people that technology affects, or at least not always. And that's particularly true for AI systems that have broad societal impacts. And this disconnect creates the risk that the values that shape data and AI are incongruent with broader societal values, and they're incongruent with people's expectations for things like fairness and the public good. And when this happens, the harms are too often felt by those most marginalized or underrepresented in society. So we see this, for example, in things like hiring algorithms which are biased against minority groups, for example. That's not to say that we are anti-innovation or anti-progress. We absolutely believe that data and AI have a place or have a role in advancing outcomes for everyone in society. But we believe, or our evidence suggests to us, that where data and AI does work for people in society, such as by advancing medical understanding or improving government services or whatever it may be, those benefits happen because those systems are built in alignment with the values and choices of the people that they affect. And what this means is that in order to kind of make that alignment happen, to ensure that data and technology is designed alongside or aligned with the values of people in society, we need, in addition to ethical, legal, historical, and political analysis, we need to understand a range of people's perspectives and create space to amplify their voices, and particularly the voices of those most marginalized, so that we can understand their values, their wants, their hopes, their concerns when it comes to designing and deploying and creating policy around data and AI. And so we fundamentally believe that it's really, really important to deepen participation in the design of policy and practice relating to AI. And one of the reasons for this is that in a report by one of my colleagues called Participatory Data Stewardship, she identified a negative feedback loop which exists in society, where the misalignment of data and AI creates kind of harms in society that further pushes and disenfranchises people away from being involved in data and AI. That means there's an even greater misalignment between kind of the needs of society and the way these technologies are designed and the way policy is written about them, and that enables a negative feedback loop. Instead, she describes a more positive feedback loop, or a virtuous circle, as she described it, where the ultimate goal is this box at the top, that data use and data governance models and the AI built upon them is underpinned by a strong sense of trust and governance. When you have that, you have fairer and more equitable outcomes from these systems for people in society. That then means you get a broader welfare outcome supported by data. So these systems are better able to improve society, to make people's lives better. When people recognize these systems are beneficial, that increases the social license, increases participation, and ultimately that then makes more representative and inclusive and proportionate design and use of data-driven systems, and that then feeds back to the top and underpins our data governance models with a strong sense of trust and confidence. So you can read a lot more about this cycle in Participatory Data Stewardship. I'm going to continue drawing on this particular report in a moment, but suffice to say, getting this positive feedback loop to happen, aligning the design of data and AI, aligning the values that inform the design of data and AI with people involves greater participation. So what is participation? What does it look like? In that same report that I mentioned just before, where the feedback loop came from, we also describe this hierarchy or this spectrum of different mechanisms or models or purposes for doing participation. So inform, consult, involve, collaborate, empower. These are all things that you will do with the public. And I want to kind of take each of them and describe them using some case studies. But before I do that, I just want to make clear these aren't 5 discrete categories. This is like a broad spectrum. We're not saying that because something sits in the inform category, it can't also be consulting or involving, or that something can't be between the space between collaborate and empower. It's a loose framework rather than a prescriptive set of categories. But nevertheless, I'll walk through them with some examples and case studies. And just to say, in the report, which you're all welcome to download from our website and have a read, we also use some case studies in there. I'm going to talk about a few of those, but I'm also going to refer to some kind of bonus, extra, additional content, so that if you do decide to read the report, you'll see something new and not just a rehashing of what I've said here. So the first category I want to talk about is inform. This is very much a method of participation that is one-directional, so to speak. So it's about telling people about what data-driven and AI systems do and what rights they have, how it might impact them, and so on. And there's an organisation in the UK called Understanding Patient Data who've done a huge deal of really fantastic work to try and promote and help people understand and ask questions about what happens to their health data in the United Kingdom. And they have this great article on their website which kind of explains what is transparent data use. And I've just pulled 3 points out from their article. One is that they simply say transparent data use is explaining what data is being used, by who, why, and how it's looked after. And I really like this because in all the public engagement work we've done and all the research we've done, the what, the who, the why, and the how are the most important things that people are concerned with. They do not want detailed technical information. They want to know who's using their data, why they're using it, how it's being collected, and what it's being used for. And really importantly, that information has to be checkable and accessible. So when it comes to informing people about data use, there has to be the evidence that underpins it to be able to scrutinize and say, okay, are they doing what they say they're doing, and so on. And just the third point, which kind of reiterates something I've touched on, the average user doesn't need in-depth knowledge, or shouldn't need to have in-depth knowledge of system structures, of language and relationships. They shouldn't need to know the ins and outs of an organization or its technology to be able to understand how their data is being collected and gathered and used. But another less specific type of informing people about data use, I suppose, is thinking about the way we talk about data. And there's this great paper by Pushman and Burgess called Big Data, Big Questions, Metaphors of Big Data. And in it, they look at all the ways that data is talked about. Data as oil, data as gold, data as fuel, data as value, data as something that flows, as something that can be hacked, breached. All these metaphors essentially boil down to the way we think about data as it being either a natural force to be controlled or a resource to be consumed. And I think this is really important because although when we're talking to people about when organizations are talking to their users about how data is used, they might not necessarily refer to it as a force to be controlled, a resource to be consumed, but implicitly they will be referring to it as a resource that they use. And that has big implications for the way they describe it, the way they think about it, and ultimately where the power lies. So I think, as well as kind of really specific information about specific data uses, it's really important when we're informing people about how data is used that we reflect on the particular language, the implicit metaphors, the assumptions that I guess subtly shape the way we think about these technologies and the systems that are built upon them. The next level up from informing is consulting. This is slightly more two-directional, and it's about gathering, not just telling people information, but gathering their views on a topic. So one example of this is running public attitude surveys. This is work that we've done at the Ada Lovelace Institute. A couple of years ago, we did a big survey on the views of the UK public on the use of facial recognition in society. 4,000 or so people online, and we kind of gathered their views on what they thought was acceptable, not acceptable, what they were comfortable with, what they weren't comfortable with, and so on. Another example of this is a location data dialogue, which is happening currently, which I'm working with a UK government body called the Geospatial Commission on. And that's where they've gathered around 80 people from across the UK, and through a series of virtual workshops, they're asking them what they think about location data, sharing some information with them about the kinds of ways location data can be used, and then asking them for their thoughts and perspectives on the implications that location data has for things like privacy, for things like innovation, for things like tackling climate change, and so on. And I think these are good examples of consulting, because what it is it's organizations going out to the public and saying, hey, we want to understand your views so that we can better shape our policy, or we can better shape our response to policy. We don't write policy at the Institute, but obviously the views we gather from the public inform the way that we might try and influence policymakers. So consulting whereas informing is giving information to people about data use, consulting is about asking people for their views on data use or on AI. The next mechanism of participation I want to talk about is involving. This is more of a, rather than information being given or information being received or views being received, this is much more conversational, much more of a dialogue. So for this, I want to talk about another project we ran at the Ada Lovelace Institute called the Citizens Biometrics Council. So this was a mini public. You might be familiar with things like citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies. We called this a citizens' council. It's essentially where you gather together members of the public through, over time, discuss a particular topic with them and come to some sort of conclusion or set of findings. So we gathered together 50 members of the public from across the UK. We worked with them for more than 60 hours in total. It was a mix of in person. This was just before that picture on the bottom right was just before the pandemic hit. Where we were all in a room together, but then obviously we had to go online for the rest of it, but it still worked perfectly. And what we did here was we involved them in our Institute's development of recommendations around the use of biometrics. So through those 60 hours of deliberation and workshops, we brought in experts from police forces using biometric systems, from campaigners who were trying to prevent the use of these systems, from academics who were assessing the impact of these systems, technology developers who are making facial recognition or fingerprint scanners. So a real range of experts from across the landscape. And we also presented a range of information from newspaper clippings to academic articles and all sorts, and gave the council the space to consider all this evidence, to discuss with the various experts we brought in, and ultimately develop their own recommendations for what they think should happen in relation to biometrics in the UK. And they came up with a set of recommendations that centered around things like ensuring that we have stronger and better regulation for biometric technologies in the UK, ensuring that we have an independent body to provide authoritative oversight of these systems in the UK, and then ensuring that we have standards that technologies deploying and designing biometric systems must adhere to. And this is evolving because we didn't kind of just take their views and then come up with conclusions ourselves. We worked with the council to develop those recommendations, to develop those conclusions, and we are currently in the process of developing our own advice policy recommendations to the UK government on what should happen with biometrics, and the council's findings are directly being input into that. So another method of participation, which is slightly a step up from involving. So before we involved people through the council in our development of recommendations, but you can go a step further and you can involve people in the writing of policy. So the example I want to talk about for this is the Camden Data Charter. So Camden is a local authority, a local government in London in the UK. It's a borough of, I think, around 1 million or so people, so quite substantive local authority. And they're developing a data charter which will give them a policy framework and a set of principles to guide their approach to data use, to how they use the data that they gather about their citizens. And to develop this charter, they've been working with a group of residents to not just kind of gather their views on what the charter should be, but to collaborate on writing the charter. So it's been a really interesting project. They're currently in the final phases of refining the charter, but they've been doing it really closely with members of their, with citizens and residents in their local area. It's a really interesting example of directly collaborating with citizens on data policy. And then the final level that I want to talk about is empowering. This is where you empower people to either have direct control over data or to directly shape the way policy is developed and enacted. And there aren't, I'll admit, a huge number of examples of this existing so much at the moment in society. There's one example that we draw in our report, which is called Salus Co-op, which is a cooperative based in Spain that provides a platform so that their users can store their health data in a secure kind of repository, and then the users can directly control who does or does not get access to that health data for medical research purposes. So rather than looking after the data on behalf of citizens, it creates a place for data to govern, for citizens to govern how their own data is collected and used and by whom. So I've kind of whistled through those categories there: inform, consult, involve, collaborate, empower. As I say, it's a spectrum. It's not to say that because you're empowering someone, you're not also collaborating with them, or just because you're informing someone doesn't mean you can't involve them. Often projects and examples of participation can sit across that spectrum. But I guess the final thing I want to talk about and I guess close on are what can we learn from participation. So I kind of started out by explaining why participation is important and hopefully making a case that you feel convinced about as to why participation is important. Talked about some examples of what participation looks like, but I think it's also really important to reflect on what we can learn from participation. And part of this comes from a space of thinking, I don't think participation is the answer to all of our data policy and AI policy questions. Even though I work in this area, I'm aware it has its limitations, it's not perfect, but it is really important. And I think it's really important to learn not just about, to think about what we can learn, not just from specific projects, but overall, what can participation in data and AI tell us about some of the issues we're talking about and thinking about when it comes to data and AI policy. So the first lesson I have learned from working in this space is that we need to focus on building trustworthiness, not trust. I don't know if this is the same in Europe, but in the UK at least, particularly in the US, there is a huge focus on how can we build public trust in the use of data, or how can we get the public to trust this particular AI tool. And I think we really need to shift the onus away from asking the public to be more trusting and towards data developers and AI developers to be more trustworthy. Not only is that the better focus, you can't trust something that isn't trustworthy, or at least if you do trust something that isn't trustworthy, it's misplaced trust. So not only do we want to focus less on asking the public to be more trusting and focus more on having trustworthy data and AI, also, most technology innovators and policy makers can't do all that much about public trust. But what they can do is make sure that they're using more trustworthy practices. And that is actually the best mechanism to build public trust. So that's the biggest lesson, and one that I raise in every meeting I ever have with a policymaker. And if you want to read more about trustworthiness and trust, Honora O'Neill is a British philosopher who is the expert on trust and trustworthiness. The second thing that I have taken away from all this work on participation is that often diversity is more important or more useful than representativeness. Of course, if you're running a large national survey, if you're doing some consulting and you're doing a large survey, then yes, absolutely, you need it to be representative of the population that you are surveying in order for it to be valid. But oftentimes, representativeness means that minority perspectives are at best kind of underrepresented, at worst completely ignored. And so it's really important, whether you're doing a large survey or whether you're doing something more deliberative, community-based, qualitative, to ensure that you boost or overrepresent diverse, underrepresented perspectives in your group. So whether that's by having, if your country's population is say 10% minority ethnic, you shouldn't have 10% of your public participating minority ethnic groups. You should have way more than that. And the reason for doing that is because you're not looking to have every view represented. You're looking to have as diverse a range of perspectives in the room as possible, and to do so from an intersectional lens. And you can only do that if you recognize that everyone's bringing a different story far and beyond just the discrete demographic categories that they represent. And so by bringing more perspectives into the room and focusing on diversity rather than representativeness, you will have much better outcomes, you'll develop much better policy, and you will not ignore any perspectives, and you'll prevent that challenge of the harms of AI and data disproportionately falling on underrepresented communities. Again, there's a really great paper on this, Rethinking Representation and Diversity in Deliberative Mini-Publics. Highly recommend. It's a short paper, but if you're interested in this, it's a paper I always go to whenever I'm thinking about sampling and recruiting for participatory projects. The third thing I've learned, and this is something I've reflected on and hopefully comes through implicitly, or at least maybe even explicitly in the case studies and in the framework, is there is no one-size-fits-all approach to participation. As our spectrum has shown, you can do everything from surveys to town halls to citizen deliberation to data cooperatives. There isn't one simple solution to increasing participation in a project. Instead, to find out what the right mechanism of participation is, you need to think about, anyone interested in doing it needs to think about, what are the objectives? What are we trying to achieve? Do we need to inform people about something? Do we need to empower them by bringing them into the design and deployment of our system? And of course, all these things have different implications for time, capacity, resource. And so it's really important, rather than to just go, oh, we should run a citizens' jury on this topic, to think about what the problem is and work backwards from there, in the very same way that any good researcher would identify the problem and then the methodology, rather than the methodology and then the problem. And again, perhaps slightly more theoretical paper to refer to, but that spectrum that we referred to is inspired by this paper by Arnstein, written in the late 60s, called The Ladder of Citizen Participation, which talks about these different levels. And Arnstein is quite critical of many forms of participation, which I think is also something that's important to remember. And then the last thing, and really the point I'd like to close on, is that people can handle complexity if they're given the space. One of the criticisms I'm often given or presented with when I speak to policymakers or lawyers or technologists about citizen participation is to go, well, how on earth could your average member of the public talk about biometrics or talk about AI being used in healthcare? And my answer to that is always, people deal with complexity all the time in their everyday lives. They drive cars, they navigate tax systems, they do their own job, which no doubt have complexities. They pay attention to the news, they understand climate change. Regardless of the polarization of misinformation and extreme viewpoints in society, the vast majority of people can handle complexity if given the space, if they're given the resources, the information, the support, the access to materials, and the time to engage with these topics. They can do so in a really informed and thoughtful way. And again, a really good paper on this is Crisis of Democracy and the Science of Deliberation. But actually, the better way to sum up this final point is from a quote by a guy called James Fishkin, which is this: everywhere you go, people are smart. They just need a reason to think their voice matters. And that is so true in every public engagement project or public participation project I've been involved with. The feedback you get from people that they are being heard, they are being listened to, is incredible, and that motivates them to do the reading, to engage, to be thoughtful, and you get fantastic results. So I will end there. Hopefully that was fairly coherent and interesting, and I look forward to questions and discussion.